She wakes before the sun. Not because an alarm forces her to. Not because she has somewhere to be. She wakes at 5:40 in the morning because she has woken at 5:40 every morning for as long as anyone around her can remember, including herself. She is 91 years old. She lives in a small house in rural Japan. Surrounded by a vegetable garden she tends with her own hands. She has no chronic pain. She takes no daily medication. Not for her joints, not for her blood pressure, not for her heart. When I reviewed her blood work 2 years ago, her inflammatory markers were comparable to those of a healthy adult in their late 50s. My name is Dr. Kenji Watanabe, and I have spent over 40 years observing what separates people who age like her from people who do not. What I want to tell you about is not her diet in general. It is not her genetics, her village, or any quality of the air or water where she lives. What I want to tell you about is what she does in the first 60 to 90 minutes after she opens her eyes. Because in 40 years of practice, watching patients age across a full spectrum, from those who remain strong and mobile into their 90s to those who lose that capacity in their 60s, the morning is where the most consistent and medically significant differences appear. She does 5 things every morning, in the same order, before she speaks to anyone, before she looks at any screen, before she leaves her home. 5 specific actions that, from the outside, might appear to be nothing more than the quiet habits of an old woman moving slowly through the start of her day. From the inside, from a biological standpoint, they are something else entirely. They are a sequence of inputs delivered to the body during the precise window when the body is most receptive to them, targeting the exact physiological systems whose degradation is responsible for most of what people over 50 experience as aging. I am going to walk you through each of those 5 actions in this video. I am going to tell you what each one is, what it does to the body at the cellular and systemic level, and why the fact that it is done in the morning, specifically in the morning in a specific order, is not incidental but biologically essential. And I am going to show you, with clinical evidence drawn from my own observations of patients over decades, what happens when this routine is disrupted, because that disruption and its measurable consequences is what confirms that what we are looking at is not folklore or coincidence. I want to be direct about something before we begin. The 5 things this woman does are not expensive. None of them require equipment. None of them require a gym membership, a supplement protocol, or a dietary overhaul. They are available to any adult, anywhere, regardless of their current physical condition. What they require is sequence and consistency, and I will explain precisely why those 2 factors matter as much as the actions themselves. The reason I am making this video is because I keep seeing a specific pattern in Western adults who are trying to improve their health in their 50s and 60s. They add good habits. They take better supplements. They improve individual meals. And they do not get the results they expect because they are adding isolated inputs to a system whose foundational morning architecture is still working against them. What this woman does is not a collection of good habits. It is a biological priming sequence, and understanding it as such changes what you do with the information. Let us begin at 5:40 in the morning, when she opens her eyes. Before I walk you through the first action, if what I just described is the kind of information you have been looking for, and you want to understand not just what to do but why it works at the biological level, this is what this channel is for. Every video here follows the same structure. Specific mechanism, specific application, nothing vague. Subscribing takes a few seconds. Now, the first thing she does before she does anything else. The first thing she does before she stands up, before she goes to the kitchen, before anything else, is drink warm water. Not tea. Not coffee. Not cold water from a bottle on the nightstand. Warm water, prepared the evening before in a small thermos and left within reach of where she sleeps, so that she does not have to walk to the kitchen before performing this first action. The water is warm enough to feel gentle going down, approximately the temperature of a comfortable bath, and she drinks approximately 200 to 250 milliliters, which is close to 1 full cup, slowly over the course of 2 to 3 minutes. This practice is common across the traditional Japanese elder households I have observed. It is also among the most biologically significant morning behaviors I can point to, not because warm water is magical, but because of what the body has been doing for the 8 hours preceding it, and what the body requires in order to function optimally during the first movements of the day. Here is what happens during sleep. The body loses water continuously through respiration and through the skin, even in a cool room, even without visible sweating. Over 8 hours, a typical adult loses between 400 and 800 milliliters of water, sometimes more, without consuming anything to replace it. By the time you wake, your blood is measurably more viscous than it was when you fell asleep. Your cells are in a mildly dehydrated state, and your joints, the spaces between your bones lined with cartilage and filled with synovial fluid, are operating with synovial fluid that has become thicker and less effective as a lubricant than it will be once that fluid is replenished. Synovial fluid is not simply a lubricant in the mechanical sense. It is the primary vehicle by which nutrients are delivered to cartilage tissue, which has no direct blood supply. Cartilage receives everything it needs: oxygen, glucose, amino acids for repair, through the absorption of synovial fluid during the compression and decompression of movement. After 8 hours of stillness and mild dehydration, the synovial fluid in your joints is concentrated and less mobile. The cartilage surfaces that have been resting without compression are mildly desiccated. The first full weight-bearing movements of the day, standing, walking to the bathroom, going downstairs, occur in joints that are, in a real and measurable sense, not ready for that load. This is not an abstract risk. The pattern of pain and stiffness that most adults over 50 experience in the first 30 to 60 minutes of the morning, the joints that ache, the back that takes time to loosen, the knees that protest the first flight of stairs, is not purely a consequence of age or inflammation. A significant component of morning joint pain is the mechanical consequence of loading dehydrated, poorly lubricated joints before they have been given the inputs they need to function. Warm water, consumed before standing, begins to address this immediately. The absorption of water into the bloodstream begins within 5 to 20 minutes of consumption. Blood volume increases. Viscosity decreases. Synovial fluid production is supported. And the warmth of the water, as opposed to cold water, matters for a specific reason. Cold water triggers a mild vasoconstrictive response as the body works to protect core temperature. Warm water does not. It is absorbed more readily, it does not divert resources to thermal regulation, and it supports the peristaltic movement of the gastrointestinal tract in a way that cold water does not, activating the gastrocolic reflex that prepares the digestive system for the food that will arrive shortly. After 50, this mechanism becomes more important, not less. Thirst signaling, the physiological sensation that tells you that you need water, becomes less accurate with age. Studies consistently show that older adults reach significant levels of dehydration before experiencing thirst. This means that waiting to drink until you feel thirsty in the morning is, in an older adult, waiting until the dehydration has already produced its effects on joint lubrication, blood viscosity, and cellular function. The practice of drinking warm water first, before thirst, before appetite, before any other morning input, bypasses the thirst signaling problem entirely. It is not responsive hydration. It is preemptive hydration, timed to the moment when the body needs it most and before the first physical demands of the day are placed on tissues that depend on it. The practical application is straightforward. A thermos of warm water prepared the night before and placed within arm's reach requires nothing from you in the morning except the decision to drink it before you stand up. 1 cup. Warm. Slow. First. After the water, she does not stand up. She moves, but she moves while still on her sleeping surface, before she places any weight on her joints for the first time in the day. What she does is not what most Western adults would recognize as stretching. It is slower than stretching and more deliberate. It targets specific joints, the ankles, the hips, the spine, in a sequence that moves from the periphery inward, working the smaller joints before loading the larger ones. She spends approximately 5 to 8 minutes in this sequence before she rises to standing. She has done this every morning, on every morning of her adult life, without exception. To understand why this matters, why it is not simply a warm-up routine but a medically significant biological practice, you need to understand something about how cartilage is nourished, because most people do not. Cartilage is one of the only tissues in the human body that has no direct blood supply. There are no capillaries running through the cartilage in your knees, your hips, your spine, or your ankles. This means that cartilage cannot receive nutrients the way most tissues do, passively through the bloodstream. Instead, cartilage is nourished through a process called imbibition, the mechanical compression and decompression of the tissue during movement, which drives synovial fluid in and out of the cartilage like a sponge being squeezed and released. When you compress a joint, synovial fluid is expelled from the cartilage. When you release that compression, synovial fluid is reabsorbed, bringing with it the nutrients and oxygen the cartilage cells need to survive and repair themselves. This means that cartilage health is directly dependent on regular, rhythmic movement across the full range of each joint. It also means that a joint that is loaded without first being mobilized, that goes from 8 hours of complete stillness to full weight-bearing in the span of seconds, is being compressed in a state where its cartilage is maximally dehydrated and its synovial fluid is at its thickest and least mobile. The mechanical stress of that first full loading falls on cartilage that is not primed to absorb it. The floor mobilization sequence that this woman performs before standing addresses this directly. By moving the joints through their range of motion while non-weight-bearing, while lying down with gravity not compressing the joint surfaces, she initiates the imbibition process without the mechanical stress of full loading. She is, in functional terms, rehydrating her cartilage before she asks it to bear weight. By the time she stands, the synovial fluid in her joints has been circulated, the cartilage surfaces have been primed, and the first weight-bearing movements of the day are falling on tissue that is ready for them. The specific movements are not complicated. For the ankles, slow circular rotation in both directions, followed by repeated dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, drawing the toes toward the shin and then pointing them away, which mobilizes the ankle joint and begins to address the shortening of the calf musculature that accumulates during sleep. For the hips, gentle knee-to-chest pulls performed one leg at a time, which mobilize the posterior hip capsule and the lumbar spine simultaneously. Slow windshield wiper movements of the legs, knees bent, feet flat, allowing the knees to fall side to side, which address internal and external hip rotation, the ranges of motion most commonly lost in sedentary adults over 50. For the spine, slow segmental movements that begin to separate the vertebral surfaces and stimulate the intervertebral discs, which are also avascular and depend on compression and release for their own nutrient delivery. After 50, the importance of this sequence increases substantially. Cartilage thickness decreases with age. The chondrocyte, the cells responsible for cartilage maintenance and repair, become less metabolically active and less responsive to mechanical stimulation. The window between adequate loading and excessive loading narrows, and the consequences of repeatedly loading unprepared cartilage accumulate. The progressive joint degeneration that most adults over 50 accept as an inevitable feature of aging is, in a significant proportion of cases, the cumulative result of years of morning loading placed on cartilage that was never given the 3 to 5 minutes of preparation it required. For someone who does not sleep on a floor surface, this sequence is fully replicable in a bed. The non-weight-bearing position is what matters, not the surface. Performing these movements before getting out of bed, before the feet touch the floor, before the spine is loaded vertically, preserves the biological mechanism entirely. After the water and after the movements, she goes to the kitchen. And the first thing she eats is not breakfast. It is a small amount of natto, fermented soybeans, consumed alone, without rice, without anything else, in a quantity roughly equivalent to 3 or 4 tablespoons. She eats it slowly. Then she waits. She opens the shutters. She attends to small things in the house. And approximately 20 to 30 minutes later, she prepares and eats her actual breakfast. The natto comes first, intentionally, always, before anything else enters her stomach. I want to explain precisely why this sequence matters, because it is not intuitive, and because the biological mechanism behind it is one that most people, including most physicians, have not fully considered. Your gut microbiome, the community of bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms living in your digestive tract, is not a passive population. It is an active biological system that influences inflammatory signaling throughout your entire body, regulates your immune response, produces compounds that affect your brain chemistry, and directly impacts your metabolic function. After 50, the diversity and stability of the gut microbiome tends to decline, for reasons that include reduced dietary fiber intake, increased antibiotic exposure over a lifetime, changes in gut motility, and the gradual degradation of the gut's mucosal immune layer. And as that diversity declines, the balance shifts toward a microbiome that produces more inflammatory compounds and fewer of the short-chain fatty acids, particularly butyrate, that suppress systemic inflammation and support gut barrier integrity. Fermented foods deliver living microorganisms to the gut. In the case of traditional natto, these include Bacillus subtilis var. Natto, which survives gastric transit and reaches the intestines alive. In the case of unpasteurized miso, They include a range of lactic acid bacteria and beneficial yeasts. These organisms do not permanently colonize the gut in most cases. What they do is transiently populate it, produce beneficial compounds during their residence, and provide a form of ongoing microbial support that maintains the gut environment in a state more favorable to the beneficial organisms already present. The key variable, and this is the part that most people do not know, is the state of the gut when the fermented food arrives. In the fasting state, after the overnight period during which the stomach has been empty and the gastric pH has shifted, the gut is in its most receptive condition for new microbial input. The stomach acid, which would neutralize many microorganisms in a fed state, is present but not at its most concentrated. The motility pattern of the gut in the fasting state, a wave-like muscular contraction called the migrating motor complex, is actively sweeping the intestine clean of debris and old material, creating a cleaner surface for new organisms to interact with. The absence of other food means there is no competition from macronutrients for the gastric environment. When fermented food is consumed first, before coffee, before protein, before carbohydrate, the organisms in that food enter a gut that is prepared to receive them. When it is consumed after other foods, after coffee, which alters gastric pH significantly, or after a large protein meal, which stimulates high volumes of acid, the organisms arrive in an environment that is substantially more hostile, and their biological effect is reduced. Beyond the microbial input itself, fermented foods consumed in the fasting state begin producing short-chain fatty acids almost immediately upon reaching the intestine. Butyrate, in particular, is absorbed directly by the cells lining the colon, where it serves as their primary energy source and activates anti-inflammatory gene expression. This butyrate production begins within minutes and continues for hours, modulating the systemic inflammatory environment from the gut outward, before any other food has arrived to compete with that signaling. In adults over 50, for whom gut microbiome diversity is declining and systemic inflammation is typically increasing, this first small fermented input, consumed first before anything else in a gut that is fasting and receptive, is not a marginal intervention. It is a daily recalibration of the gut environment that compounds in its effects over months and years. And it costs, in practice, nothing more than a small container of fermented food placed on the kitchen counter the night before. After the natto, while she waits before breakfast, she goes outside. Not for a walk, not for exercise. She simply steps out of her house and stands, or sits on the step near her garden, for somewhere between 5 and 15 minutes. She does this in all weather except heavy rain. She faces east when she can, though she does not do so deliberately. It is simply where her garden is. She does not wear sunglasses. She does not look at her telephone. She is outside with her eyes open, in the morning light, before the day has fully begun. This is the fourth action in her morning sequence, and it is the one that most clearly illustrates the difference between a practice that looks simple from the outside and a practice that is, biologically, doing something specific and significant. The human body runs on a 24-hour internal clock called the circadian rhythm. This clock is not a metaphor. It is a molecular mechanism present in virtually every cell of the body, a set of interlocking protein loops that cycle over approximately 24 hours and regulate the timing of nearly every physiological process. Hormone release, immune function, cellular repair, metabolic activity, inflammatory signaling, and sleep architecture. These cellular clocks must be synchronized to the external world each day, because they drift without regular input and because individual cells drift at slightly different rates. The primary signal that performs this synchronization, in the brain and throughout the body, is light. Specifically, it is short-wavelength light in the blue spectrum, detected by photoreceptive cells in the retina called intrinsically photosensitive retinal ganglion cells. These cells project directly to the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the hypothalamus, the master pacemaker of the circadian system, and the signal they send upon receiving morning light triggers a cascade of hormonal and metabolic changes that set the body's internal clock to the current time of day. Cortisol release is initiated and peaks appropriately. Melatonin production is suppressed, confirming to the body that the night is over. Insulin sensitivity is primed for the metabolic demands of the active day. The immune system transitions from its overnight repair mode toward its active surveillance mode. The key word in that paragraph is morning. The circadian system is not indifferent to when light arrives. It is specifically calibrated to respond to early light received within the first 30 minutes of waking, as the primary synchronizing signal. Light received later in the morning produces a weaker synchronizing effect. Artificial indoor light, even bright office lighting, delivers light intensity that is typically 10 to 50 times lower than outdoor light on an overcast day, which is insufficient to produce the full synchronizing response in the circadian system. Adults who spend their mornings indoors, who wake up, move through a lit house, and spend the critical synchronization window under artificial light, do not receive the circadian signal their biology requires. The result is a clock that runs slightly out of synchronization each day, never fully corrected. Over time, this chronic circadian misalignment produces measurable consequences. Elevated resting cortisol at times when it should be low, impaired insulin sensitivity, disrupted sleep architecture at night, and, critically, elevated systemic inflammatory markers. The relationship between circadian disruption and inflammation is not theoretical. Studies of shift workers who experience chronic circadian misalignment consistently show elevated levels of the same inflammatory cytokines, interleukin-6, tumor necrosis factor alpha, C-reactive protein, that drive joint deterioration, cardiovascular disease, and metabolic dysfunction. After 50, this mechanism becomes more consequential because the circadian system itself ages. The suprachiasmatic nucleus loses neurons with age. The amplitude of circadian oscillations, the strength of the peaks and valleys of the daily physiological rhythm, decreases. The system becomes less robust, less self-correcting, and more dependent on strong, consistent external timing signals to maintain synchronization. An older adult whose circadian system receives inadequate morning light is working with a regulatory system that is both declining and being undersupported. The practical application requires nothing except going outside. 2 to 10 minutes of outdoor light exposure without sunglasses within 30 minutes of waking, in conditions bright enough to see clearly, even on an overcast day, delivers sufficient photonic stimulus to set the circadian clock. The eyes need to be open and facing the general direction of the light. Direct solar gazing is not required or advisable. Simply being outdoors in daylight with eyes open in the morning is sufficient. This is what she does. She stands in her garden. She looks at her plants. The light reaches her retinas, her suprachiasmatic nucleus fires, her cortisol peaks at the right time, her insulin sensitivity is primed, and her inflammatory regulatory systems are calibrated for the day. She does not know any of this is happening. She simply knows that she has always done it, and that the mornings when she does not feel different, heavier, slower, less sharp, than the mornings when she does. When she comes back inside, she prepares breakfast. And here is where I want to be precise about two things: what is in this meal and what is not. The meal itself is not large. It is composed of 4 components that appear consistently in the morning meals of the traditional Japanese elders I have observed who maintain strong health into their 90s. First, warm miso soup, made from unpasteurized fermented miso paste dissolved in dashi broth, typically containing tofu, wakame seaweed, and sometimes a small amount of root vegetable. Second, a protein source, most commonly a small whole fish, 2 eggs cooked simply, or a serving of firm tofu. Third, plain short-grain rice or barley, cooked simply without additions. Fourth, a small amount of pickled or fermented vegetable, sukmono, on the side. That is the meal. For components, let me explain what each one is doing biologically. The miso soup does several things simultaneously. The fermented miso delivers a second dose of beneficial microorganisms and anti-inflammatory peptides to a gut that has already been primed by the earlier natto. The dashi base, made from kombu kelp and katsuobushi dried fermented fish, delivers iodine, fucoidin from the kelp, and glycine from the fish-derived collagen, the amino acid that is the primary building block of joint cartilage and that is nearly absent from the muscle meat-dominant Western diet. The warmth of the soup activates peristalsis and prepares the digestive system for the protein and carbohydrate that follow. The protein source is consumed at breakfast deliberately. Morning is when the anabolic response to dietary protein is strongest. Muscle protein synthesis, the process by which the body uses dietary amino acids to build and repair muscle tissue, is regulated by a combination of insulin signaling, leucine availability, and the post-overnight elevation of growth hormone and IGF-1 that occurs in the early morning. A protein-containing meal consumed during this window produces a meaningfully stronger muscle-building and muscle-preserving response than the same protein consumed later in the day. After 50, when muscle protein synthesis becomes less efficient at baseline, a condition called anabolic resistance, the importance of consuming adequate protein during the morning anabolic window increases, because the window itself is the period when the impaired system is most capable of responding. The fish specifically delivers two additional compounds that are particularly relevant to joint and cardiovascular health: EPA and DHA, the long-chain omega-3 fatty acids that are the direct precursors to anti-inflammatory prostaglandins and resolvins in the body, and hydroxyproline, a collagen-derived amino acid that signals the body's own collagen-producing cells, fibroblasts, and chondrocyte to increase collagen synthesis. These compounds work best when consumed together in whole food form rather than as isolated supplements, because the lipid matrix of the whole fish supports the absorption of the fat-soluble compounds in ways that extracted supplements do not fully replicate. The rice or barley delivers glucose slowly, without the insulin spike produced by refined grain products, providing sustained energy for the morning's activity without the inflammatory and metabolic consequences of a high-glycemic breakfast. Now, what is absent? There is no refined sugar. There is no processed grain product. There are no industrial seed oils, the refined vegetable and seed oils that dominate processed Western food and that are high in omega-6 fatty acids, which at the ratios present in the typical Western diet, competitively displace omega-3s and shift the body's inflammatory balance. And there is no caffeine before the food. That last point deserves specific attention. Coffee consumed before eating, before any food has entered the stomach, elevates cortisol. This is true in all adults, but the degree and duration of that cortisol elevation is greater and more prolonged in adults over 50, whose cortisol regulation is less efficient. Elevated morning cortisol before food produces impaired insulin signaling for the subsequent meal, which means the glucose from that meal is handled less effectively and produces a larger and more prolonged blood sugar response. It also elevates inflammatory signaling acutely. None of this means coffee is harmful. It means coffee before food on an empty stomach in the morning, when cortisol is already naturally at its peak of the daily cycle, amplifies a hormonal response that does not need amplification. She drinks green tea after her breakfast, when the food she has consumed has already moderated the hormonal environment. I want to address something that is rarely discussed in health or nutrition content, because it explains a phenomenon that many people have experienced and never understood. Why two people can follow what appears to be the same routine and get substantially different results. The answer is not always in what they do. It is often in how consistently they do it, and specifically whether they do it at the same time each day. This is not about discipline or willpower. It is about biology. The body operates anticipatory systems, physiological responses that begin preparing for an expected event before that event occurs. You have experienced this without knowing it. If you eat lunch at noon every day, your stomach begins producing digestive enzymes and your blood glucose begins to rise slightly at approximately 11:30 before you have eaten anything. Your body has learned the pattern and is preparing the infrastructure in advance. This anticipatory preparation improves digestion, moderates the glycemic response to the meal, and reduces the metabolic cost of processing the food when it arrives. This mechanism extends far beyond digestion. The immune system modulates its activity in anticipation of the daily pattern of behavior. The liver upregulates detoxification enzymes at the times of day when it has learned to expect metabolic demand. The gut increases motility and enzyme production in advance of regular mealtimes. The adrenal glands calibrate cortisol output based on the established pattern of the preceding days. These are not passive adaptations. They are active, learned, anticipatory preparations that the body invests in when the behavioral pattern is reliable enough to warrant that investment. The technical term for this is conditioned metabolic response, and it is the physiological mechanism that explains why the same breakfast, consumed at the same time every day for years, produces a smaller inflammatory and metabolic response than the same breakfast consumed at irregular times. The body has prepositioned its regulatory systems. The response is smoother, more efficient, and lower in cost. After 50, this mechanism becomes the dominant reason why consistency matters more than optimization. The aging neuroendocrine system, the network of hormones and neural signals that governs almost every aspect of metabolic function, loses its responsiveness to acute signals. It does not adapt as quickly to sudden changes. It does not mount the same robust acute response to a novel positive input that a younger system would. What it retains and what it responds to most effectively is rhythmic, predictable, repeated input. The aging body is, in a very specific biological sense, a system that is becoming more dependent on routine and less capable of benefiting from inconsistency. What this means practically is that the value of any single morning action is lower than the value of that action performed consistently at the same time as part of a stable sequence. The natto she consumes before breakfast is more effective because her gut has been trained to expect it and is prepositioned to receive it. The movement she does before standing is more effective because her neuromuscular system has been primed for that sequence and initiates its own preparatory responses before she begins. The outdoor light exposure is more effective because her circadian system has been conditioned to use that signal reliably and has reduced its reliance on backup synchronization mechanisms. This is also why people who adopt individual healthy habits in isolation, a better breakfast here, a supplement there, occasional exercise, frequently do not achieve the results that the scientific evidence for each individual practice would predict. The practices are real. The biological mechanisms are real. But the conditioned metabolic response that amplifies their effect requires something that isolated habits do not provide: consistent, reliable, time-anchored repetition over weeks and months before the anticipatory systems engage. She has been performing this same sequence at the same time every morning for over 60 years. Her body does not simply tolerate it. Her body has built its entire morning regulatory architecture around it. Over 40 years of practice, I have had the opportunity to observe something that most clinical research cannot easily capture. What happens to a patient's body when a long-established healthy routine is suddenly disrupted? The disruptions I have observed have come from many sources: travel, hospitalization, surgery, the death of a spouse, a move from a rural home to an assisted living facility. In each case, the disruption was involuntary. The patient did not choose to break the routine. Circumstances broke it for them. And in nearly every case involving a patient who had maintained a consistent traditional morning practice, the physiological consequences of that disruption were measurable, rapid, and, to someone who did not understand the mechanism I described in the previous section, surprising. Within 3 to 5 days of routine disruption, the patients I observed showed consistent patterns. Morning joint stiffness increased, often noticeably, in patients who had been largely pain-free. Sleep quality degraded, with patients reporting lighter sleep, more waking through the night, and greater difficulty returning to sleep in the early morning hours. Appetite patterns shifted, with reduced hunger in the morning and increased hunger at night, a reversal of the circadian feeding pattern that had been established over decades. And in patients for whom I had access to blood work during and after periods of disruption, inflammatory markers, particularly C-reactive protein and interleukin-6, rose within the first week, and in some patients continued rising for 2 to 3 weeks before beginning to stabilize. These observations are clinically significant because they confirm something that cannot easily be inferred from studying healthy individuals. The morning routine is not simply a collection of beneficial practices whose absence leaves the body in a neutral state. It is an active regulatory input whose cessation produces a measurable withdrawal in the systems it was supporting. The body had built anticipatory responses around the routine. When the routine stopped, those anticipatory responses fired without the input they were prepared for, and the regulatory systems they were supporting became destabilized. The patients who recovered most quickly, who reestablished their physiological baseline within 1 to 2 weeks of returning to their routine, were those who reinstituted the full sequence in order as quickly as circumstances permitted. The patients who made only partial recoveries, who resumed some elements of the routine but not others, or who resumed them in altered forms, showed incomplete recovery of their pre-disruption baseline, sometimes persisting for months. Equally instructive were the patients I observed on the other end of this spectrum, those who had adopted westernized morning patterns during middle age and had never established the traditional sequence. These patients, living in the same geographic region, eating broadly similar diets outside the morning hours, with comparable socioeconomic backgrounds, showed a consistent and measurable difference in their baseline inflammatory state compared to age-matched peers who had maintained traditional morning practices. Their morning cortisol peaks were less well-timed. Their reported joint stiffness was more frequent and more prolonged. Their inflammatory markers were, on average, higher across multiple measurements over time. The difference was not attributable to major lifestyle factors, diet quality, physical activity level, smoking status, or alcohol consumption, which I controlled for as carefully as clinical observation permits. The difference correlated most strongly with the presence or absence of the morning sequence. Not with any single element of it, but with the sequence as a whole performed consistently at the same time since early or middle adulthood. This is what separates this morning routine from lifestyle advice. Lifestyle advice tells you that warm water is good, that outdoor light is beneficial, that fermented food supports gut health. All of that is true. What clinical observation adds, and what the disruption data makes clear, is that these inputs, delivered in a consistent sequence at a consistent time, produce a regulatory effect on the body's inflammatory and metabolic systems that is greater than the sum of their individual contributions. That is not a claim I make to persuade you. It is a pattern I have watched repeat itself, in patient after patient, over 4 decades. At this point, you have heard about 5 specific morning actions: warm water before standing, floor-based joint mobilization before weight-bearing, a small fermented food before the main meal, outdoor light within the first 30 minutes, and a composed breakfast built around protein, fermented broth, and marine fat with caffeine after food rather than before it. You have heard about why consistency and timing amplify the effect of each individual action. And you have heard what happens clinically when the routine is disrupted. I want to close this part of the video by showing you something that ties all of it together, because I think it changes how you understand what you have just heard. Each of these 5 actions targets the same biological window. The 60 to 90 minutes between waking and the end of breakfast is not simply the beginning of the day in a social or logistical sense. It is a distinct physiological transition, a regulated shift that the body makes from its overnight repair state to its active daytime state. During sleep, the body is running a different set of programs from the ones it runs during waking hours. Inflammatory cytokines generated during the previous day's cellular activity are being cleared. Growth hormone is facilitating tissue repair. The gut is running its migrating motor complex, cleaning its own surfaces. Cortisol is beginning its rise toward the morning peak that will initiate the waking state. Melatonin is declining. The immune system is transitioning from repair to surveillance mode. This transition takes time. It does not complete the moment you open your eyes. It unfolds over the first 60 to 90 minutes of the morning, and every input delivered during that window either supports or disrupts the quality of that transition. Warm water delivered before standing supports the joint system before it is loaded. Floor mobilization before weight-bearing supports cartilage before it is compressed. Fermented food in the fasting state supports the gut before other inputs alter its environment. Outdoor light supports the circadian system at the moment when its synchronizing signal is most potent. Composed breakfast during the anabolic window supports muscle protein synthesis at the peak of its daily responsiveness. None of these interventions is fighting against the body's biology. Each of them is working with the body's own architecture, with processes that the body initiates every morning regardless of what the person does, and that are simply better supported when the morning inputs align with them than when they do not. The woman who wakes at 5:40 in rural Japan and moves through her morning sequence is not following a health protocol. She does not know the terms circadian synchronization or conditioned metabolic response or imbibition. She is doing what her mother did and what her mother's mother did before that. A practice refined not through scientific knowledge but through the accumulated observation of a culture that noticed generation after generation that people who maintained this pattern aged differently from those who did not. What medicine can do and what I have tried to do in this video is explain why. The morning window is not a metaphor for a good start to the day. It is a specific biological transition whose quality is determined by the inputs delivered during it. In the bodies of Japanese elders who remain pain-free and disease-free past 90, that transition is consistently well supported. And the tools required to support it are the same tools that have been used in rural Japanese households for generations: water, movement, fermented food, light, and a composed meal, available to any adult anywhere who chooses to use them in the sequence and at the time when they work. What I will address in the next part of this video is what happens after the morning, whether the benefits of a well-executed morning routine can be sustained through the rest of the day, what specific afternoon and evening habits either reinforce or undermine what the morning built, and what the clinical evidence shows about the relative weight of the morning versus the rest of the day in determining long-term physical outcomes. That is where we go from here. If you stayed through this entire video, you now have something more than a list of morning habits. You have the biological mechanism that explains why those habits work, why the order matters, and why consistency over time produces results that isolated efforts do not. That is information you can actually use. The next video in this series covers what happens after the morning, the specific afternoon and evening inputs that either extend the benefit of what the morning built or quietly erase it. If you want to see that when it is published, subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss it. If this video gave you something genuinely useful, a comment about which part was most relevant to you helps this content reach others who are looking for the same thing. That is all. Thank you for watching.